75% of an entire generation between 18 and 24 are ineligible to join the military. 75%. Can you say the word pathetic with me? Why? Well, there's a high level of obesity. This is embarrassing. Obesity. Unfit physically, unable to perform the most basic military maneuvers. Uneducated. Oh, wait a minute. Are you going to say we're uneducated? You can go to school and be uneducated. Isn't that an incredible realization? That you can go through school and they can pass you because they don't want you just lingering in the grade. And they'll keep moving you through the system and they'll stick out practically illiterate students all the time. They can find oatmeal in the grocery store because they recognize the oatmeal box, not because they can read oatmeal. Unlearned mentally, unable to pass the most basic academic tests of competence. We can't hear. You have to be able to hear, I guess, to get into the military at some level. Lost acute hearing ability due to the volume of music. It's embarrassing. We are unfit to protect our lives, to protect our marriages, to protect our families, to protect our towns, protect our states, to protect our nations. We are unready for battle. So the dumbest generation ever. This is the book that I was referring to. It's actually called The Dumbest Generation, or this is the other option title for it, or Don't Trust Anyone Over 30. That's an attitude of an entire generation. You can't trust these guys. Those over 30, we have definitely seen some weaknesses in the older generation. There's no doubt about it. But I want you to know, those over 30 possibly know more than you do as those of you that are under 30. You may know more about computer programming. However, they oftentimes know more about life. And we have disconnected ourselves from any knowledge fuel source that would give us an understanding of how life actually works. So look at this. It goes through, I think it's like 6 things I'll mention here, but 6 observations of why we are the dumbest generation ever. How do you guys like being classified as that? Isn't that a fun title to wear? See, I'm trying to get you mad, is what I'm trying to do. Don't accept that title. Don't sit around and allow that to be your title. Hit it back. Knowledge deficits. The least supply of common life, social, and cultural knowledge of any generation. This is my little statement that I add to it. Disconnect them from their devices and they die. See, as long as they have their computer, their laptop, their PDA, whatever it is, they can make it through life. They can figure out directions. They can do their research. How do they do their research? Google. That's their research. And so as a result, you disconnect them from their devices, stick them in a forest all by themselves and, run away with the car. They die. They have no way of surviving. They do not know how to live outside of the system. They're bibliophobes, which isn't just a fear of the Bible. This is a fear of books. The highest disregard of books and reading of any generation. Now look, there's my comment. Give them a book and they turn it into kindling. Number 3, screen time. It's the greatest amount of time in front of a screen of any generation. I mean, you could say, well, previous generations didn't even have screens. I don't know what it was, the 40s or 50s when television started coming out, and they were watching television all the time because it was such a novelty. It doesn't even compare to what we are doing in this generation. We are almost always in front of a screen, whether it's a computer screen or a television screen or a movie screen. Almost always, or a cell phone screen. Whatever it is, we are addicted to the screen. And obviously, this is having some kind of effect upon us. Don't expect them to be involved in the rescue of this world, for they are completely lost in another one. Online learning skills, the least effective research skills which garner true information of any generation. Our generation does not know how to find true information. We know how to find information. We have the information superhighway. Oh yeah, we know how to find information. Is it true? Are you able to test and see if it's true? Do you have any filter of knowing if it's true? Well, it's the highest Google ranking. Let me tell you, the highest Google ranking is nearly inevitably wrong. Okay? It does not necessarily mean it is right. It just means more people are turning to it than something else. There are all sorts of top Google rankings in this world, but that does not mean that they are true. The motto for information gathering, the highest Google ranking, rules. Wikipedia is the new Bible, and good bloggers are the oracles of the now. If you can write, this generation will submit to you, lay down their lives before you and say, train my mind how to think. It does not mean that you know how to live. It does not mean you have a scrap of actual real-world intelligence. You have not earned a medal through your life lived, and yet you can write, and you can impress people with your phraseology, and as a result, this generation will submit to you, and they will follow your lead. You could be 17 years old and not know a thing, but you can write. You can control the minds of a generation. Betrayal of mentors is another hallmark of this generation, of these 18 to 24-year-olds. They're the most apt to disbelieve, disregard, or betray teachers and mentors of any generation. Their commitments mean nothing, for they are loyal only to that which feels good to them in the moment.
Last questions for Corbett Post. This coming from Chris Weston, who writes, I've heard various seemingly unconnected people on the world stage mention the phrase New World Order, and you often speak of it on your program as though the existence of this thing, whatever it is proven. I have people all over the internet refer to it as fact. So what is the NWO? Is it a policy or a group? And what is your proof that it exists and or is working to achieve a goal rather than just greedy people working individually to achieve more money? I'm aware of the Georgia Guidestones and various people with huge amounts of money trying to affect world affairs in some sort of global way, but the implication seems to be people are working together to achieve this order. What is the proof that people are working together to achieve some sort of presumably detrimental actions, rather than just a buzz phrase used by politicians and rich people that is meaningless? Thank you very much for the question, Chris Weston. I appreciate it. I appreciate the sentiment behind this question as well, because it's a phenomenon that I've noted as well in my own research over the last several years, that the New World Order catchphrase is becoming more and more of a political buzz phrase, so that every single time it is used is not necessarily relevant to the same degree, at the same level. So, for example, if a Joe Biden says it in a speech, or a Saakashvili, I don't put as much emphasis on it as I do when, for example, a Kissinger or a Brzezinski or whoever is talking about this. So I think that we have to separate out the times that it's used and the context it's used. But I don't think it's right to frame the New World Order as a policy per se, or as a group per se. I think it is a part of an ideology of globalization, that has been explicitly articulated in various ways by various different people in ways that I think are linked, but not necessarily the same people in the same group. In its modern political context, can be traced back at least to H.G. Wells, who wrote a book called The New World Order, where he outlined his vision of what the New World Order is, basically the technocratic society that he elsewhere referred to as the Brotherhood of Masons, or the Wings Over the World, or various other iterations he put to it. He also wrote a book about the Open Conspiracy, talking basically about this New World Order, where there was a famous quote about many people will die protesting the New World Order, but it's necessary, something along those lines. I'll include the link to the quote so you can read it in its own words. And that was most notably picked up, of course, in 1991 by the George H.W. Bush speech, where at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, he was outlining the chance for a new world order, which is a rule of nations over the international system, the rule of law over the international system. So it's not just the law of the jungle, there will be a rule of law among nations. And I think that's probably the articulation that most of the modern formulations of this idea work under, both from the US and NATO and the Kissingers and those types of people, the Bushes, whoever, and also from the other side, which is the Putins and China and others, who explicitly time and again have called for a new world order as being that type of framework of a rule of law in the international system, rather than the unipolar American world, which Putin is railing against or whatever. Again, it's whichever formulation you take, it's about this process of globalization.
That chemtrailing and geoengineering, it doesn't exist.
It's not a coincidence that chemtrailing, HARP, geoengineering, everything is happening right now while they gave you a phone to stare at. Not only phones, you know what I'm talking about. When you get inside a car.
And he said, if it doesn't go through to the bomb. It'll aim it at your head and make you make a mistake. And that's really got me interested from that point, because I thought, well, how can microwaves going into your brain make you make a mistake? What the fuck is going on? It is a perfect stealth weapon. And when governments don't like a group of people, and it's a weapon that you don't know you're being targeted, because the dose is very, very low.
I'm impressed. I mean, by now, not only the governments, they have all admitted it. It's happening. They've opened the game. They've said, yes, we're doing it.
Aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat, in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do.
And it's a silent thing. This is exactly what people are feeling. I mean, this is exactly what's going on. There are so many people trying to explain the anomalies in the sky. The Wi-Fi clouds. Are we being microwaved? Because this is a little different, folks. It's like this. If you do not agree with the game, you're going to be microwaved.
It is a perfect stealth weapon. And when governments don't like a group of people, for instance, the ladies who protest at Greenham Common in England about the American missile base, they camped, they were microwaved. We microwaved Catholics in Northern Ireland.
We're talking about Facebook being the filter. Think about it. They would only need to know who you are and tag you. Once you're tagged, they would microwave a certain region or you yourself. So, of course, this leads into another conspiracy, the one in which a lot of people believe in a certain agenda that they will diminish the population because of this and that. How are they going to do it? One of the ways, of course, could be with microwave and HARP and antennas. There are so many people that want to know about 5G technology and all that. CERN, what is all this, right? What is all this? Why is it happening now? So I just want to point out something that I've realized after all these months, after all this show that they've been putting in our faces. You've realized it's a show, right? We wouldn't be able to realize the changes that would be happening right in our faces, just like now. If you ask your neighbor about chemtrailing or geoengineering, they're going to call you crazy. And of course, this is concerning. Not only that, they've been planning to shut down, theoretically, the web. So,
hi, everybody. April 10, 2018. China to make it rain over area 3 times the size of Spain. We are living an unbelievably surreal life now. It's hard to understand how it is that people are denying weather modification. Oh God, when there is so much evidence of it. But what do people do with this information that comes from mainstream media, RT? Do they just say, oh, RT, well, that's Russian propaganda about China? Do they just never look into it? But it's been in mainstream media, Western mainstream media. The Guardian reported on geoengineering projects going on all over the world. Oh my God. Oh, how do you deal with this insanity? Yeah, China now will be making rain 3 times the size of Spain. Since 2013, China has been creating 55 billion tons of artificial rain a year. The country is now embarking on its biggest rain-making project ever. I will link below to this article and circulate it to those that don't believe you, still believe that nothing has changed in the sky. It's all perfectly normal. And Mother Nature, God, still in control of our weather. Maybe this will crack open their closed minds. According to media reports, the government will use new military weather altering technology developed by the state-owned China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. The country plans to build tens of thousands of combustion chambers on Tibetan mountainsides. The chambers will burn a solid fuel, which will result in a spray of silver iodide billowing towards the sky.
And ultimately the formation of global governance, not global government, global governance. And I think there may be something to that distinction. It may not be a distinction without a difference. There may be a difference there. Insofar as I think that there is maybe a cartoonish tendency to see the global government can only be this system where there's a president, God, emperor, whatever, that dictates to all of the nations individually, and that's the structure of global government. As I've been attempting to articulate in recent podcasts, I think it's more nuanced than that, and the system that is being formed right now, demonstrably, behind the scenes, is this system of the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the G20, the OECD, the Bank for International Settlements, the Financial Stability Board, the World Customs Organization, 1,000 other institutions that are right now laying the regulatory framework for global tax compliance and global customs enforcement and global trade agreements and treaties and all of these things that are forming a structure that is global governance, but it's not necessarily seen as global governance. The best example of that in recent months is this G20 rubber stamping the Financial Stability Board's white paper on bank bail-ins that basically make the regulatory framework for bank bail-ins possible, i.e. in the next banking crisis, it's not going to be the government's bailing out these banks, it's going to be the depositors who are also going to be on the hook, and you're going to have to give over a portion of your savings to these banks to help bail them in. And that, again, that structure is the Financial Stability Board, which no one knows about and works behind the scenes, and it's never reported on, was set up by the G8 originally, I believe, and the G7 maybe back in the time when it was originally set up, and reports to the G20, and works with the Bank for International Settlements and writes these white papers and technical papers and regulatory frameworks that are over the head of 99.9% of the public. No one will ever hear about it. No one understands or knows about it. But they write these very technical white papers. They go to the G20. The G20 rubber stamps them. And then each G20 member nation implements those policies individually through their own national governments. It's an international policy being coordinated at the international level that is then enacted at the national level. That is the type of globalization that we could be facing in this new world order, rule of law, global governance. And that's very difficult to understand and get people's heads around. It's much easier just to paint it as, global government the way people think of it as, one God, emperor, dictator, and everyone basically being slaves underneath. It's more nuanced than that, I think, in a lot of ways, and thus more difficult to understand. So you're right, there is the tendency to portray this in a kind of cartoonish way, but I think we have to take it seriously when there are people in positions of power with real political, economic, financial power in positions that are able to affect international regulation and regulatory frameworks and the like, who are articulating a vision of what they explicitly call the New World Order. We should listen to those speeches. We should actually listen to what they're saying rather than jumping to our own conclusions about what they're saying or trying to dismiss it. Oh, that's all just conspiracy theorizing. No, these people are saying something. Let's listen to what they're saying, because otherwise we are ceding the linguistic battlefield to these people, and we're basically allowing them to to continue doing what they're doing, working behind the scenes. And the idea that this is not being done right now, this international regulatory framework is not being put in explicitly and consciously as part of an attempt to form a greater global governmental system is naive, and we suffer if we don't take it seriously. So I appreciate you allowing me to articulate some of that. If you want some more articulation of that, I did touch on this topic in my recent Q&A with the students at the University of Groningen, so you can consult one of the questions in there that talked about this idea of global government. But perhaps my most formulation that I'm most proud of, well, actually, I also wrote an International Forecaster editorial this past weekend. None of the above, how to avoid the globalist trap. So that also touches on this idea of that type of globalization and how we can actually counteract it. Probably the most interesting conversation I've had along these lines was a couple of years ago. I was on the Mind Renewed podcast with Julian Charles, where we talked about this phrase, the New World Order, what types of groups and what types of people are behind it, how it's not necessarily one coordinated agenda, it's an ideology that different people subscribe to for different reasons, and how best to counteract that. A very interesting conversation. I'm quite proud of that one, so I'll put that, of course, in the links in the show notes, so you can go and listen to that.
But listen to this, sprayed from planes. The particles will provide something for passing water vapor to condense around, forming clouds. Those clouds will bring the rain. A single cloud seeding chamber could create a strip of clouds covering a 5-kilometer area. Traditionally, the rain-making process or cloud seeding means rocket launching chemicals into clouds, which accelerate the creation of ice crystals that eventually become rain. China also uses military aircraft for those purposes. Rainmaking is also a popular way to clean up air in China, where heavy smog is a big problem for many cities. The practice of weather modification has become more frequent across the country in recent years, including for major public events. In 2008, China launched over 1,100 rockets containing silver iodide into Beijing skies before the Olympics opening ceremony to disperse clouds and keep the Olympics rain-free. Beijing has a development plan for weather modification until 2020. Do we think it's only China? Is that what people will think when they read this article? Oh, it's only China. And they've only been doing it recently. It's known, it's out there. We have been modifying the weather for a very, very long time. But when we've been doing this in wars, Vietnam War, to muddy the roads so the Viet Cong could not travel on them, all of this is known. How is it that we can't get through to people? Oh, wow. It's just a wow. What can you say about the time we're living? But wow.
What would cause these straight lines, 90-degree angles and clouds? Very bizarre. I've got one coming up here in just a short while that is really amazing. It was taken from a jet aircraft looking down from inside the window. You're going to see the glare coming up on the window. Look at this. This is just bizarre. What would cause something like this in the weather scheme? I have no explanation for this. If somebody has an idea of why this would happen, leave your comments below. This is a strange one. Just wanted to share with you. Take care.
So everything is being weaponized. This is from January 5th, 2016. U.S. Army looks to strike foes with lightning weapon. And again, they've had this for decades. When you hear about it and say they're going to use it, they've been using it. A U.S. Army lab is testing how lasers create an energized plasma channel in the air and an invisible pathway for electricity to flow. The laser-guided lightning weapon could precisely hit targets such as enemy tanks or unexploded roadside bombs or neighborhoods in Santa Rosa, California. Army researchers used a, quote, ultra-short pulse laser of modest energy, end quote, that keeps the laser beam focused through its own intensity electromagnetic field, can harvest electrons from air molecules to create the plasma pathway for electricity to follow. Again, they've had this technology for quite some time. Okay, this is from a site, Black Projects, directedenergyweapons.net. And for anybody that thinks that they don't have directed energy weapons, they're not using them, this is for you. I'm going to go through these different torture devices, energy devices, mind control devices, voice to skull devices, having a camera in your eye devices, all used patents. Look at the dates way back when, over 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, they developed these weapons. So let's go through these. Method and device for producing a desired brain state, 2012. Pulsative manipulation of nervous systems, August 31st, 1998. Multifunctional radio frequency directed energy system, 2005. The RFID system, radio frequency directed energy system transmitter, and at least in one antenna. In the transmitter and antenna, direct high energy power electromagnetic energy towards a target sufficient to cause high energy damage or disruption of the target. Method and device for implementing the radio frequency hearing effect. Suitable forms of carrier-suppressed modulation include single-band and carrier-suppressed amplitude modulation with both sidebands present. This is 2002. Apparatus for audibly communicating speech using the radio frequency hearing effect. This is voice to skull, V2K. Torture devices. RF energy hearing systems. Simulation of sensation of hearing in persons of impaired hearing can cause total deaf utilizing RF energy.
And, well, many of you know the whole, well, hybrid warfare. You know that we are living a time of unconventional, asymmetric, irregular, hybrid, new generation warfare. The doctrine of this hybrid warfare, well, essentially it's summed up as war is not declared at all. Military action starts with the activities of militant groups during peacetime. Now, when you hear militant groups, understand that these tactics are being used on ordinary citizens around the world. Ordinary people on the internet. So non-contact clashes between highly maneuverable fighting groups are used. All right, think of the fighting groups, not just as those insurgents, those rebels that we fund, but think about fighting groups here on the internet, the conservative versus the liberal, Christians versus whomever, Jews, blacks versus whites. All fighting groups are easily maneuverable. An enemy's military and economic resources annihilated by means of precise strikes on strategic military and civilian infrastructure. So this document is mostly about information, the hybrid information war, the weaponization of social media. But all of this doctrine, the hybrid warfare, the mass abuse of high precision weapons and special operations, robotics, and weapons that use new physical principles, directed energy weapons, such as lasers, shortwave radiation, all of this is taking place. You see it operating. You see all of these wars that we are engaged in the Middle East in particular, simultaneous wars taking place. And they're using all of these unconventional weapons. Think about the directed energy weapons, the lasers used in the California fires. Think about all of the weather being used as a weapon. the directed energy that they are putting into these storms. All of this is going on as I speak. The simultaneous strikes on enemy troops, the simultaneous battles on land, air, sea, and the information space. And troop management in a unified information sphere. Troop management, yes, in a unified information sphere. Well, think about the internet. Think about the 40 million that the State Department has transferred to the Department of Defense. Is it the state transfer? We now can mobilize people to help one another and raise funds for social causes, investigate crimes, and provide greater assistance to humanitarian disaster relief efforts. All right, what did I think of? I thought about all of the mass shootings, and all of a sudden you see all of these GoFundMe pages that suddenly appear within minutes right after a shooting. And they get so many people to donate. And these people are just throwing their money away because these mass shooting events are false flags, staged events. I also thought of the white helmets. The white helmets, those humanitarian good souls, the white helmets in Syria. They use social media to promote the white helmets. They get the white helmets, those who just got the Academy Award for that documentary. They legitimize terrorist organizations and they give them awards. And on social media, they prop them up. And they get an awful lot of people donating to the white helmets because they have been able to deceive them into thinking that this organization is humanitarian, and it's not. You know, I mean, I could never, ever, ever, ever engage myself in this kind of work. I don't have it in me. What is it about people that can be engaged in this kind of work? To lie, to deceive, to destroy other people, to bring about more and more lies and more disinformation. How can they not see that their work is nothing but evil? Comes to mind. All right, hybrid warfare can be characterized as a form of warfare which comprises a mix of methods: conventional, unconventional, military, non-military, overt, covert, involving cyber and information warfare aimed at creating confusion and ambiguity on the nature, the origin, and the objective of these actions. This is what we are seeing mainstream media do every single day. This is what we see the trolls on the internet doing every single day. So what makes modern warfare so different is the effects the information can cause to the development of the conflict, as audience perception of the outcome of the conflict matters more than the actual facts on the ground. That's right. It's a fight over control. It's a fight over control of people's perceptions and behavior. It's an integral part of modern conflicts. Information warfare. Yeah. Used right here. Intelligence collection. You think your emails, your phone calls, all of your comments, your posting videos, everything that you post anywhere is now being collected and stored and will be used against you if necessary. Focused search for and analysis of information from social media networks and profiles, including content and conversations, done either overtly or covertly. It's the intelligence collection, trends, networks, sentiment, geo, content, behavioral, systemic information. All information is being collected and analyzed. Every individual, you, me, we've got our own profiles for our intelligence agencies to use against us when the day comes and they find it necessary. Analysis can contribute to target audience analysis to support psychological warfare or the selection of targets for operations both on and offline. Think about all of the targeted individuals. Social media makes it possible to get detailed information. You don't have to be physically present. It's a useful source for situational awareness, identifying the early warning signals of a future crisis. Crowdsourcing. So they're talking about the crowdsourcing sites where people are working with one another to crowdsource all the information, the facts and the evidence, all of the research. It's an easy way to get in there and stick in disinformation.
Microwave hearing system. Sounds induced in the head of a person. Sounds induced into the head of a person by radiating the head with microwaves in the range of 100 megahertz to 10,000 megahertz that are modulated with a particular waveform on a logarithmic computer. Communication systems and methods including brainwave analysis and or use of activity, 1998. The brain activity of an individual is monitored and transmitted to a remote location, Wi-Fi. They could take your thoughts, your brainwave patterns, your memories, and transfer it onto a computer and then overlay it with others and then put it back in your brain to totally fry your brain. Apparatus and method for remotely monitoring and altering brainwaves, August 1974. It goes on. Look at all the patents, phones. Dream state teaching machine. This is where they can overlay dreams and nightmares. So every night you don't want to go to sleep because you have nightmares that are horrific. A device for enhancing lucidity in the dream state of an individual. Non-contact vital signs monitor, 1988. All right, therapeutic behavior modification. Compliance monitoring. Compliance, will you obey? And feedback system, 1997. A therapeutic behavior modification program, compliance monitoring, and feedback system includes a server-based relational database and one or more microprocessors electronically coupled to the server. The system enables development of the therapeutic behavior modification program, having a series of milestones for an individual to achieve lifestyle change. Who's telling you what to change? They will be. Magnetic excitation of sensory resonances. The invention pertains to influencing the nervous system. The method and apparatus can be used by the general public, and it can also be used against you for relaxation, not letting you relax, sleep, not letting you sleep, arousal, make you go crazy, and clinically for the inducement, if they want, of tremors, seizures, and emotional disorders. 1995, folks. Electric fringe field generator for manipulating nervous system. Brainwave inducing system, 1997. You see all the torture devices they have available? Method and associated apparatus for remotely determining information of a person's emotional state, 1994. Method and apparatus for inducing desired states of consciousness. You get the idea. Nervous system manipulation by electromagnetic fields from monitors. It is therefore possible to manipulate the nervous system of a subject by pulsing images displayed on a nearby computer or TV set, 2001. This is how they excite us. They change our behavior, electromagnetism in our bodies by the flicker rates of the monitors of the screens you're looking at right now and by the TVs on your children. Psychoacoustic projector, a system for producing oral psychological disturbances and partial deafness in the enemy during combat situations. Touchless torture, target humanity is a 3-hour video I did on all this subject of all these different devices. I'll put it in the show notes. This has been going on around the world, beta testing, and they plan to roll it out with everybody soon. So it's very important we learn all their different controlling devices wirelessly using touchless torture that more and more people are getting subjected to. at random. Method and system for altering consciousness. Silent subliminal presentation system. The modulated carriers may be transmitted directly in real time or may be conveniently recorded and stored in mechanical, magnetic, or optical media for delayed or repeated transmission to the listener. Get that? Delayed or repeated transmission to the listener. This is brain overload, horrible thoughts, feelings, whatever. They can overlay it and put it on you, and your life is hell. 1997, subliminal acoustic manipulation of the nervous system. Okay, so you get the idea. It goes on and on. Please look at these all. I'll put them in the show notes, folks. Method and an apparatus for inducing and establishing a change of state of consciousness. Electroacoustic device, this is the Y2K, includes a sound generator, system for producing synthetic human speech, this is voiceover, connected to a modulation for superimposing the output signals. They can vary your voice, they can copy your voice, they can mimic you. 1990, method and apparatus for varying the brain state of a person by means of audio signal. And it goes on and on. Multi-channel system for multifactorial method for controlling the nervous system of living organism. Get what they're trying to do here, folks, with all this stuff? Technology is light years ahead of what we're being told and sold and shown.
Scientists are mute on the subject. It is not part of the debate on climate change, although it is acknowledged that, that these techniques do disrupt climate. And ultimately, the scientific debate on owning the weather for military use. I'm using the terms of the U.S. Air Force. Those are not my terms. The U.S. Air Force says we must own the weather. We must own the weather so that we can use the weather for military purposes against enemies of the United States and the Western world. So that is the background.
Why?
You know, and they do talk about, they use as an example what was happening in the Ukraine a couple of years ago. Here, for example, a joint project run by the Atlantic Council and Belingi Cat. I don't know if that's the correct pronunciation, but they were able to track and provide evidence for the presence of Russian troops in Ukrainian territory simply by collecting information from social media profiles used by Russian soldiers, Google Maps, images in the media. So it makes it possible to counter information, counter disinformation. They infiltrate everything. Cyber operations targeting social media platforms and accounts to breach password protected spaces, alter the content of a profile, render a website completely unusable. Cyber operations, either offensive or defensive, include actions like distributed denial of service, attacks on websites, password hacking to gain access and expose the content of chat rooms, emails, cell phones, altering content in social media accounts, or intrusion into databases in order to collect information. Activities are aimed at preventing other actors from using social media platforms to communicate, coordinate actions, access information, or distribute messages, at least temporarily. They have been so effective in making sure that we don't coordinate and that our communication is just filled with tension. And all of those who leave, you know, comments saying this one's a shell and this one's a different information agent, and you don't provide evidence to back up your claim, you're a tool. You're a useful idiot because you're helping to break down trust. And that's why I do at times get very upset when I see those kinds of comments with no evidence. It's just somebody's opinion, but it influences people. So they love it when you write those comments. You're on the wrong side. You're helping the wrong side. That's what you're doing. Activities are aimed at preventing other actors from using social media platforms to communicate, coordinate actions, access information, or distribute messages. Command and control, using social media for internal communication, information sharing, coordination, synchronization of actions. Important for non-state actors such as insurgent groups, particularly if these groups lack formal structure or are dispersed over large geographical areas, means of communication and a way to coordinate these activities. However, you can use the social media to expose the activities of insurgent groups to intelligence services. However, whatever information is useful for them, they use these defensive and offensive tactics to gain control over that information. Swarming tactics, the distribution of information to mobilize and coordinate non-state actors with a common interest. Using social media, actors are able to gather quickly for protests, giving security. We put on social media, oh, let's have a protest. Okay, let's put in the date. Okay, let's organize. Everything that we are doing is infiltrated with Department of State, Department of Defense, intelligence agency actors to bring down everything that could be of use in this fight. It's very upsetting to see, that 6 years ago I came onto YouTube and I was so impressed with how people were working together. There was some trust, and there was organization, and people, I could see that channels were working together. Now what I see is everybody kind of individually, they're an island unto themselves, no organization, no trust, everything's just been obliterated. And I don't like evil people winning. I don't like these sick, psychopathic, narcissistic nut jobs using all of these tactics that when you think about it, you think about the individual narcissists that the pathological narcissist, they use a lot of the same tactics. Inform and influence, psychological warfare, the dissemination of information to influence a target audience's values, belief systems, perceptions, emotions, motivation, reasoning, behavior, achieve certain military effects in the cognitive domain. Shape, inform, influence, manipulate, expose, diminish, promote, deceive, coerce, deter, mobilize, convince. I have the narcissistic family, and I read these things and I go, Jesus. I mean, it was like my little war going on with my one family unit, which was essentially what the family was doing and what families do to the scapegoat. This is the same kind of stuff. They manipulate. They lie. They influence other people. They inform other people with their lies. They diminish you as an individual. They deceive, they coerce, they deter, and they mobilize. They get their narcissistic flying monkeys out to convince others. This is such a sick world that we are living in. Some other techniques, psychological influence and manipulation on social media, increasing the visibility of the message, use of automatically generated content by spamming, or create these fake identities, trolls, sock puppets, bots, in order to spread a message and minimize alternative voices. Saturation saturating the information environment, coordinated use of blogs, posts, articles, posted and reposted by opinion leaders, activists, and fake personas. How many comments have I gotten from people or have spoken to people about? They're just on information overload. All of this is orchestrated. Hacking in order to increase the reach of a message or misdirect audiences. The hacking of trending hashtags. Targeting and distracting the opponent. Distribution of misinformation and rumors. Publicize an opponent's alleged wrongdoing. Alleged is the operative word. Attacking the target. Blocking adversary content. Or asking social media platforms to remove the content of specific profiles by complaining about inappropriate content. The reason why I'm going through this is for anybody who was not convinced that virtually everything that goes on the internet, there are people who are working to control all of the information. This document tells you that this is what's happening. And just because it's NATO, don't think that our State Department, our Department of Defense, that they're not using the exact same tactics. Personal attacks. Acquire personal information and use it to defame, ridicule, threaten. Think about Sandy Hook. Think about Wolfgang Halbig. All of the personal attacks, and I have to tell you, there were an awful lot of people who I just thought were ordinary YouTubers suddenly posting all of these videos. And it's not just Wolfgang Halbig, but they come after an awful lot of people, defaming them. Some threaten them, ridiculing them. So we have an awful lot of people on YouTube that are not who they claim to be. And that's why, I have said in many, many videos, we've got to be proactive in terms of building up trust, which means we've got to be aware of the presumptions that we make about others. No, your presumption, your opinion, it's not fact. And it's really important to keep it to yourself. Because very often, with presumptions made about people, you're wrong. So you're putting out a lie. And you're hurting another human being. And you're breaking down trust. I read the comments, and I hear what some of you are doing. But you know how many times I have been told or heard from other people who are quote-unquote awake, they talk in a big game, and then it's when you get into their life, you see, oh God, another one who they talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. So it's until you can actually see if what people say matches what they do, that's when you get to know if that is a trustworthy individual. But you can't know that. Not in this cyber world, because you have to be a part of somebody's life in real life to see how they're living their life, to see what they do. But internet trolling, organizing activities by using fake identities in internet and social media in order to achieve certain effects. Phenomenon of imitating grassroots actions using social media is known as astroturfing. It's a tool of influence, spreading propaganda and rumors, and distorting the online discussion by attacking commenters with alternative views. Here, evidence of what we are living.
You don't know can hurt you sometimes, my friends, despite what the old saying would have us believe. Done on the subject of weather manipulation, geoengineering, chemtrailing, etc. Starting off with a very interesting conversation I had the honor to conduct almost 2 years ago now with a couple of people who are well-versed in these matters, G. Edward Griffin and Michael Murphy. And Michael Murphy, of course, is the filmmaker behind What in the World Are They Spraying and Why in the World Are They Spraying, both of which I will exhort you to go and check out online. Also, and weather warfare, an increasingly important topic in these increasingly dark times. And surprisingly enough, it's a topic that is actually daring to be broached, even in mainstream media circles. I've cited this article a couple of times now, but I still think it's interesting that Yahoo would even post an article about this, let alone that they would actually broach the subject in a headline. But here it is. Could Iran's enemies really be destroying its rain clouds? And this comes from Yahoo News, and it says, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has reportedly accused his country's enemies of creating a drought in Iran by somehow destroying or co-opting its share of rain clouds. And it goes on from there. I think you get the tone of the piece from that opening paragraph. Oh, the crazy Ahmadinejad says they're somehow manipulating the weather. And they're playing the old, oh, I've never heard of that routine, which we know is a bunch of bunkum. But it's interesting nonetheless that this is actually, at the very least, getting some press, getting some headlines, getting some people to actually raise the question, wow, do you think they could be doing something like that? I mean, surely they will impose sanctions on a country that, in the case of Iraq, for example, will kill 500,000 children, but, oh, they would never think to use technology to manipulate the weather. And certainly they wouldn't have any technology for that, would they? Well, I think it's safe to say that the technology that the Department of Defense has in its arsenal is so far beyond what you and I could imagine that it would be ridiculous to sit here and believe that this is not already going on to some extent. So tonight we're going to start breaking that down, unpacking some of this. All right, well, tonight I wanted to start talking about a subject that is something that not a lot of people think of. It's not in the forefront of a lot of people's minds when we're talking about some of these events like warfare and the possibility of warfare in various parts of the globe. Something that not a lot of people have on their plate when it comes to that topic is the possibility of weather warfare and modification of the environment itself, climate, as a tool of warfare. And this is despite the fact that there's in fact a voluminous amount of detail that has been accrued over the years documenting the fact that weather warfare and climatic modification is very much a reality. So let's start talking about that. I know you've written about that extensively for globalresearch.ca. Perhaps we can talk about some of the documentation and some of the companies that are behind this climate modification agenda.
Well, first of all, I should mention that weather warfare is not something which is recent. It was used during the Vietnam War. Cloud seeding techniques, which were intended to block enemy supply lines. But in the course of the 1990s, it has become increasingly sophisticated. And I'm referring to the development, what is called the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP, which is based in Gakona, Alaska, which is a system of high frequency antennas directed to the outer atmosphere, and which then can be used to trigger climatic instability in different parts of the world, as well as disrupt communication systems. We talk about NMOD, environmental modification techniques for military use. Now, these techniques of climatic modification are, if we can trust military documents and statements of the US Air Force, they are fully operational. But there's absolutely no evidence. There are suspicions, of course. There's no evidence that these techniques have actually been applied. It's very difficult to actually test whether, you know, the activity of HAARP has led to particular climatic occurrences. These capabilities, but particularly the United States in relation to HAARP, and they have acknowledged that they intend to use these technologies of weather modification, which can trigger floods, hurricanes, droughts, earthquakes, against enemies, namely, in the present context, Syria, Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, okay? And they explicitly state that these weather modification techniques have both offensive as well as defensive applications and can be used for deterrence purposes. In other words, we are in presence of something which is very diabolical. I consider this to be the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. Why? Because it can destroy the agricultural system, it can destabilize the national ecology, the environment, it can disrupt communications networks, it can destabilize an entire national economy.
Why do you think it has been so much kept under wraps, and how are they able to maintain that level of secrecy over something that's been so out in the open for so long?
Well, I think there are two elements behind this. First of all, it's the nature of the weapon system itself. It is something which is covert in its application, so that when the HARP antennas go into full swing and trigger a particular geopolitical area of the world, okay, or a particular country, nobody knows about it. It's reported as a flood, a drought. Nobody knows about it. And it is very difficult for even for scientists to establish a link between the activity of the HARP system of antennas on the one hand and a climatic occurrence at the other end of the world. There have been suspicions and there have been some very unusual patterns which have emerged. So it's the covert nature of this weapon system, and one assumes it is heavily integrated into covert operations and so on. It's not strictly a U.S. Air Force undertaking. And there's always the possibility of denials. Yes, we've been attacked by HARP. Now, how do you prove it? But on the other hand, there have been very few scientists which have had the courage to investigate that relationship. It's a very complex relationship, namely the activity of the antennas and climatic occurrences. And the reason, as I mentioned earlier, the reason is that the scientific community is in fact more or less kidnapped by the military-industrial complex. It does not want to voice any statements which could, of course, have far-reaching implications at the geopolitical level. I should mention that one of the most distinguished scientists, Rosalie Bertell, who recently passed away, she brought out this relationship, but in a very cautious way. So scientists are mum on the subject matter. Environmentalists do not, although they acknowledge the existence of climatic warfare, they have never inserted that into their discussion on global warming or climatic instability. And I should mention that in effect, there was a convention signed between various countries, but specifically between Russia and China, going back to 1977, which it's a convention which bans the use of environmental modification techniques and recognizes their destructive applications. And at the 1992 Earth Summit, there was a reassertion of that basic protocol of 77 in the founding documents of the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, but in effect it was not really mentioned And in all subsequent venues pertaining to climate change, Kyoto, global warming, the issue of environmental modification techniques for military use is never mentioned.
Clouds, according to NASA studies, is that they're a little different than natural clouds in that they hold in and trap more heat. And when they hold in and they trap more heat, they're more humid, you get this heat trap that traps all of the other pollutants, greenhouse gases and other pollutants. So you actually keep the heat from escaping, both during the night and the day. And in trapping the heat, you warm the earth up. And you concentrate these other pollutants as well. So part of the thing about geoengineering is that we already have this geoengineering experiment, and whenever you see these jets producing the man-made clouds, we're already geoengineering the atmosphere. And so one of the things we should be doing, instead of adding more particles and chemicals to that toxic mix that we already have, we should be finding ways to have the jets run cleaner. We should have them fly at heights where they don't leave trails that persist. And we should start to move in that direction very quickly.
All right, so what can you tell us about the composition of these trails from your research?
Persistent jet contrails from my research are composed of highly toxic jet fuel emissions, which cause agricultural damage, human health problems like asthma. The EPA reports on subsonic jet fuel emissions is quite clear that there's carcinogens in them, that jet fuel is probably, I would judge from their reports, much more toxic than automobile exhaust, and that they release soot and other particles. So the plume, even though it looks light, is loaded with jet fuel emissions that are highly polluting.
And legendary researcher and author G. Edward Griffin, who are currently combining forces to create a new documentary about the ongoing stratospheric aerosol geoengineering campaign, commonly known as chemtrailing. And that documentary is called What in the World Are They Spraying? And the trailer is widely available online. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today.
Well, thanks for inviting us, James.
Yeah, thanks, James. An honor to be on your program to talk about this important issue.
Well, it is definitely an honor to have you here because this is an extremely important issue. So, Michael Murphy, let's start with you. Why don't you tell us about how you came to start working on this project with Mr. Griffin and what prompted you to take up this subject in particular?
Well, it was real interesting because, like most people, the first person that told me about the aerosol spraying, I really thought that they were completely crazy. But a couple months later, somebody had actually pointed it out and showed me a plane spraying aerosols into the sky. So naturally, I began to research this on the internet and developed a curiosity. But what really had propelled me into becoming more and more interested was back in February, where there was a geoengineering conference in San Diego, which I had attended, and I wanted to learn more about these programs. And for 3 days, geoengineers proposed their programs of stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, which essentially were programs to spray 10 to 20 million tons of aluminum and barium into the upper atmosphere for what they said was the stated goal of cooling the planet, which is very shocking because during that meeting I had learned actually, how damaging both aluminum and barium, and we can talk a little more about that further into the program, about the toxicity, both not only to human health but also to ecosystems.
My interest began probably around 10 years ago when I started to observe it in the sky. I thought, what in the world are they spraying? And it was amazing to me from the very get-go how many people could look up in the sky and either not see the spraying at all, not notice it, and it was so obvious, or if they did see it, they were perfectly content to accept the explanation that it was just normal jet trails, vapor trails. And to me it seemed so absurd that this that anybody could believe that when you compared real jet trails, which I've been watching all my life. They're little tiny vapor things that travel along behind the aircraft, don't last probably more than maybe half a mile behind the aircraft, and then they are absorbed back into the atmosphere. And then you compare that with these vaporous trails that spread all over the sky, and within an hour or two they've milked up the skies. You can hardly see the sun. But what do you mean? How can you believe that is just a plain jet trail? So I became kind of curious not only about the jet trails, but I became curious about the way in which people can be convinced of something that is so obviously not true, simply because they heard it on the television or they hear it from some authority. And so I was in a state of somewhat, I guess you'd say, anger about that, and great disappointment in the human race that so many people could swallow this line. And then I thought that surely somebody who will do a great expose on this, somebody better qualified than I was tempted at one time. I thought, no, there are plenty of engineers and pilots and scientists who should tackle this. Well, the years went by, and there really wasn't anything of, definitive on this study. So when Mike and Paul showed up at my house that day, and they were already determined to do something with it, and they apparently had the skills to do it, I thought, well, isn't this an opportunity to jump on board and see if I can help? So it was a thing that grew over many years, James.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, because I have almost the exact same reaction to the way that people are able to convince themselves that what they're seeing is completely normal and usual. And I remember at one point trying to point out to someone that what we were seeing was not cloud, and that we had just watched the sky be painted over, but they were just unable to see that. And I think that is one of those frustrating things that really makes you question people's ability to understand something of this size and magnitude.
It was interesting because, again, I'm going to go back to geoengineers' models, which were proposing dumping 10 to 20 million tons of aluminum and barium into the atmosphere. People are finding elevated levels and alarming levels around the world. And I'll give you an example of the snow on Mount Shasta. Mount Shasta is removed far from any industry. As a baseline, it should have about 7 parts per billion of aluminum. A test was done by Francis Mangels, a retired 35-year USDA biologist, and he had sent the test into a government lab, and it revealed test results in drinking water allowables. Before I tell you the numbers, will only allow for 50 parts per billion. Government action, according to Francis, is required at 1,000 parts per billion. The test that was taken on Mount Shasta revealed 61,100 parts per billion of aluminum. That is extremely high. And I want to say that because I want to go into this. Aluminum is very toxic, both to human health, and God, for the past 7 years, we've seen an incredible increase in aluminum-related illness. It's going through the roof, such as Alzheimer's and many different neurological disorders. Barium, which is being found in very high content, lowers our immune system, creates high blood pressure and a bunch of other illness. And the real thing that we had initially started finding was in Northern California, as well as around the world, they're starting to see a die-off in the forests. And insects are dying, amphibians are dying. So when we went up to Northern California, that was one of the parts, one of the many different locations that we went to in filming this, and had spoken to many professionals. They had started testing, and what they found that the pH of their soil was at a minimum 10 times the normal pH. So they began asking questions, why is the pH changing? And what they found was massive amounts of free-form aluminum. Free-form aluminum, when it falls into soil, will increase the pH. Now, in most soils, it will increase the pH. A lot of plant life and a lot of forests require an acidic soil to grow. So they believe, without a shadow of doubt, because it's what they're finding in the rain, and there is a correlation between when trails are present and when they're not. When they're not, these levels seem to come down a little bit, that this is the cause of the mass die-off that they're seeing. And with that being said, we can talk a little more perhaps later about the aluminum resistant seed that's the patent is owned by the USDA. And that's very scary in itself.
In fact, that was exactly what I was going to bring up with you. Of course, we saw Monsanto very recently talking about adding aluminum resistance genes to certain subsistence crops, and it is extremely interesting that that comes along just as aluminum levels are exploding in soils. Sort of an underlying point of this debate that a lot of people shy away from the term chemtrails, and we see all sorts of different proposed names for this, including stratospheric aerosol geoengineering. To what extent do you think that that's merely a semantic debate, and to what extent does that actually go to the root of defining what it is we're facing?
Well, I'll address that one. I think it's primarily semantic, because it's really basically the same thing. It's just that I think what they're trying to do, James, is hang sort of a negative aura to the word chemtrails to make it sound as though anybody who even uses that word is a little bit wacko. I think they're trying to do that. They're not succeeding, but I think they'd like very much to do that. I don't really care what you call it. The fact is that you can look up in the sky and you can take the measurements of what's falling out of the sky, and you can see that those are chemtrails.
Things going. I know that it started to rain. That's unusual for you guys, but rain shuts Yosemites, threatens problems at tallest U.S. dam, Oroville Dam. That's right. So, they are expecting an awful lot of rain. You will get it fast. The areas that were burned out, officials are warning of mudslides, rock slides, flooding. City of Santa Rosa, one of the hardest hit burn areas, brought in extra firefighters, emergency personnel. No, it's not the amount of rainfall that's worrying. It is how much it's going to be falling very, very quickly. They're monitoring hundreds of storm drains. I hope they keep them open, which is what they did not do in Baton Rouge when it flooded. God, what was that, 2 years ago now? I don't even remember. I think 2 years ago. Maybe it was last year. Are you getting tired of this? Are you getting tired of not being able to get through to people? That these events are manufactured by man, and it is not caused by Mother Nature. It is not an act of God. So this Oroville Dam, yes, state officials warned this week that they may have to use the partially rebuilt spillway at Oroville Dam for the first time since repairs began on the badly damaged structure last summer. So, Lake Oroville behind the dam is filling up. It's been filling up all winter. More water is coming in than flowing out, and that was as of Friday. Oh, today. The water level was last at 793 feet and dropping. Oh, okay, that's good. If it reaches 830 feet, water managers say they will open the gates to the spillway. Okay, well, I hope the spillway works. Oroville residents are rather concerned. Yes, this is caused by atmospheric river. A long plume of subtropical moisture stretching to areas near Lake Tahoe. The Weather Service issued several flood warnings throughout Northern California. But I did see this article earlier today. An uncommonly intense April storm powered by an atmospheric river was expected to swamp Northern California all day Friday, prompting San Francisco officials to put up flood barriers. Yosemites, no one can get in. Anybody camping at Yosemite, They have to, well, so they had to leave by 5. I guess everybody is gone from Yosemite's. This is what I saw on IntelliCast. This was at 10:48 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So it was, what, 7:48 in Northern California. And here we have an awful lot of ultra-low frequencies that they can use to steer, atmospheric rivers, to manipulate weather fronts. I am... What do you do with this? How do you live this utter insanity when you have mountains of evidence and you still get laughed at by people when you try to educate them on weather modification, geoengineering? That's what happens to me here. This is in Nevada. The ultra-low frequencies that are being set off are rather magnificent, and it's been magnificent all day long. All day long. Utah, Nevada, Wyoming, Colorado. Northern California. Look at, no, precipitation, natural precipitation, does not have fanned out, very defined lines. It doesn't happen. This was at 8:12 p.m. So it was 5:12 in California. And this, it's not going to stop until people wake up and begin to take a look at all of the evidence that we have. I will link to all of the documents. I'm not going to be delving into them too much, but did you know that Pacific Gas and Electric Company, a California corporation, conducts weather modification in California? And they even post in newspapers notices of their weather modification projects. Here, notice is hereby given that Pacific Gas and Electric Company will be conducting a program of weather modification by seeding of clouds with the object of increasing useful precipitation in certain areas of the Sierra Nevada mountains. Pacific Gas and Electric Company conducts weather modification. There are so many companies, commercial weather modification companies, that provide services like Acquiesce. Now, this is on the Wayback Machine. Acquiesce took down its website, and I think Acquiesce, well, here's the CEO. He's in Africa, and he's providing rain for drought-ridden states in Africa. And he even called governors in our country years ago, offering services to break droughts here in our country. And we said no. He broke a drought in Australia. And this is an Australian company, Acquiesce, Rain Aid, technology to break drought. I'll link to everything, but it is remarkable that we do have so much evidence and we can't seem to get through to people that this is happening. And you know what? It does make me upset because so many people have to suffer these manufactured weather events. But Acquiesce, this is what they have said Over the past 10 years, the company Acquiesce has repeatedly demonstrated this technology to government and humanitarian observer groups. The proprietary weather modification system operates by utilizing resonance signals, frequency signals, resonance signals to divert oceanic atmospheric rivers into areas experiencing severe drought. Now, if you can manipulate oceanic atmospheric rivers, those rivers that are above us, if you can steer them, you can create tremendous flooding or drought. California, you get flooding and you get drought. Texas, you get severe flooding, Houston, surrounding area, and then you get drought. Okay, but what does he say? The Acquiesce system does not rely on chemical or biologically hazardous materials, which could potentially harm the environment. This man has had tremendous success breaking droughts with frequencies, and he doesn't use chemicals and biologically hazardous material that we are dying from. All life is dying from. So, here is the CEO of Acquiesce, and he will explain to you how he manipulates the atmospheric rivers.
Technology relies on a signal that we're able to generate that triggers a response from atmospheric patterns. So we're able to observe this using satellite meteorology, extensively available now to everyone who's got access to broadband internet. But we're able to utilize that signal sent in sequence to generate a incremental deviation in the flow path of these oceanic atmospheric rivers. So the source is the ocean, of course. The vapor, precipitable moisture flow is in the atmosphere. The winds drive this with the pressure systems adjusting the path of least resistance. But our technology is able to interface that and hack into it, if you like, and make some micro adjustments to allow deviations to occur in the flow pathways. And this is how we broke the drought in Australia in 2005. This is how we put out the fires of Victoria from Black Saturday in 2009. This is how we delivered rain in the desert in Saudi Arabia in 2007 and snow for the first time in history in 2004 in United Arab Emirates. There's been other projects above the radar and some under the radar, but today for the first time we're putting our hand up in front of the media to say this is available. We're going to run this project here to break the drought in the Horn of Africa.
Just think, we could have put out those fires in California using this technology. This is also on the Wayback Machine with documents from Acquiesce's website that is no longer, but what does Acquiesce say? Experimental trials revealed that small amounts of electromagnetic energy applied intelligently could force change into weather based on atmospheric sine wave patterns. This research culminated in the development of an atmospheric resonance frequency technology. Electromagnetic wave forms are utilized to deliver signals toward a target weather system. This is on Northrop Grumman's website. Right here. The defense contractor. Making it rain, the science of weather manipulation. Although weather manipulation lingers on the fringes of the scientific community, and it doesn't, of course, they have to lie. They have to just say, oh, it's just on the fringe. Yeah, it's just lingering on the fringe. And, oh, look, we're just now developing this technology when it has been used for decades. And plenty of documents prove that. But yes, although weather manipulation lingers on the fringes of the scientific community, it is practiced more widely than one might expect. More than 50 countries around the world currently have weather modification programs, and nearly 50 states in the United States engage in weather modification programs. And the World Meteorological Organization just hosted an expert team meeting on weather modification in Geneva in 2017. The United States is no stranger to weather manipulation. From the mid-60s through the early 80s, NOAA actively pursued Project Storm Fury, a program for experimental hurricane modification. The Department of Homeland Security has put on workshops, hurricane modification workshops. Here we have Wyoming and Idaho engaging in weather modification. And, well, that's just a few examples. How about the National Program on Weather Modification Recommendation? And this was back in 1966. Yes, they were engaging in weather modification that early. In fact, even earlier. But we've got weather modification activity reports. The U.S. Department of Commerce engages in weather modification. NOAA engages in weather modification. And this weather modification activity reports November 1, 1972 to December 31, 1973. This was after the weather modification programs that were being used in Vietnam. How are we living this bizarre time when we can't get through to people? Now, this document itself does not provide the 67 weather modification summaries that the beginning of the document states. 67 weather modification projects between November 1972 and December 1973. 19 states, 19 U.S. states engaged in weather modification programs or projects during that time period. Oklahoma had the greatest concentration of projects. California follows with 11 projects. Oklahoma had 12 projects. We've got weather modification law precedent. And this was back starting in the 1950s. Weather modification is the effort of man to change naturally occurring weather for the benefit of some. However, some do get harmed. So, there were lawsuits starting in 1950. We have weather modification associations. Weather modification associations. Why would we have weather modification associations if weather modification was a crazy conspiracy theory? We have patents, a whole lot of patents. Patents that begin as early as 1900. This one, 1948, process for controlling weather. Or this one, the filing date, 2009, apparatus and related methods for weather modification by electrical processes in the atmosphere. The present invention provides an apparatus for weather modification. How about Project Woodpecker? The electron cyclotron resonance heating method now being used to alter the Earth's magnetic field in order to modify weather, create or trigger earthquakes and volcanoes, spread viruses, create the phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse to take out the grid, or to modify behavior control among the populace. Hearings are conducted in Congress on weather modification. This one back in 1953, weather modification experiments. The 83rd Congress, first session, created a committee to study and evaluate public and private experiments in weather modification. Articles written about weather modification, the history of weather weapons, didn't it rain? Declassified records show that from 1949 to 1955, the Royal Air Force released various substances, including dry ice, silver iodide, and salt into the atmosphere at high altitudes in order to induce rain. The clouds would then precipitate, pulled down below freezing point by the extra weight of dense particles, thus making it rain sooner and heavier than it might have done. The Guardian reported. And what took place? Within a few hours of the cloud seeding operations, some 90 million tons of water fell onto Plymouth, destroying hundreds of homes and businesses and causing the deaths of 35 people. Reporting in 2001, a BBC investigation has confirmed that secret experiments were causing heavy rainfall. And survivors tell how the air smelled of sulfur on the afternoon of the floods. And the rain fell so hard it hurt people's faces. Trees were uprooted and formed dams behind bridges, creating walls of water that carried huge boulders into the village, destroying shops, hotels, and homes. Bodies washed out to sea were never found. And it's still going on. Planetary weapons and military weather modification, chemtrails, atmospheric geoengineering, and environmental warfare. Extreme weather and climate events are linked to climate change, while no mention is made of government programs deliberately aimed at modifying the weather and inducing earthquakes and drought, rain, tsunamis. We never talk about what the military is doing. We never talk about, the mainstream media never talks about what the military is doing. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they never talk about weather modification. But it's so out there, it's so clear, it's so obvious that it doesn't need mainstream media to talk about it. And we don't need the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to talk about it. What the hell is wrong with Americans? That they simply will not acknowledge what is taking place. Public notices put in newspapers all the time about weather modification projects that some company or utility company will be engaging in. Weather modification programs. At least in the United States, it's been going on for 70 years. Public service announcements printed in newspapers back in the 1960s warned of government intention to modify the weather. Life magazine back in the 50s and 60s continually covered U.S. weather modification programs, including Project Storm Fury, which redirected and reduced hurricane intensity from 1962 to 1983. There's a chapter in a book that was published in 1968, Unless Peace Comes, a scientific forecast of new weapons, predicts the development of technologies that will use the planet itself as a weapon. And there is one chapter, which I've posted a video on this chapter, How to Wreck the Environment. It was penned by geophysicist and member of President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee, Dr. Gordon J. F. McDonald. And he stated, the key to geophysical warfare is the identification of the environmental instabilities to which the addition of a small amount of energy would release vastly greater amounts of energy. The chapter envisions 4 planetary weapons, which McDonald predicted would be fully developed by the 21st century, based on the then current state of research, then 1968, climate modification, earthquake generation, tsunami generation and direction, and mass behavior control via electromagnetic manipulation of the ionosphere. McDonald, who was Johnson's science advisor, surely knew of the military's weather modification program known as Operation Popeye, which ran from 1967 to 1972 in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Earth's atmosphere to produce targeted droughts or floods. Dr. Nick Begich, co-author of Angels Don't Play This HAARP, stated that HAARP can also trigger earthquakes and volcanoes. And Clinton's Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, said in 1997 at a conference on terrorism, others are engaging even in an echo type of terrorism whereby they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes, remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. Weather modification history. See the timeline. View news gallery. Let's go to the news gallery. All these clips of news. This, the Rocky Mountain region, the Desert Weekly, August 11, 1891, producing rain, 1891. About rain-making test unpopular in Washington. Bombardment of the sky kept up all night. November 3rd, 1892. And the news clippings are, there's a whole lot. Scientists make rainstorm, rain of death experiments, man-made rain, race on to tap clouds, rainmaker blamed for Sydney's wet summer. Rainmakers beware, cloud may belong to someone else. Man-made weather makes social problems. This is 1948. I'll link below to this. I'm going to leave you with a short clip with a man who worked for the Texas Weather Modification Program, and he talks about how man can make rain, an awful lot of it, and they can keep it just falling down on a targeted area for a really long time. So when you listen to him, think about Houston, think about Baton Rouge, think about all of the flooding. Think about the flooding back in 2011, Missouri. Think about what's happening right now in California.
This summer?
This summer.
You succeeded in increasing rainfall?
South of San Antonio, we had aircraft flying on a dozen days in the month of July, treating what we deemed to be seedable storms.
And what was the result of that?
The same result that we've seen since it started in 1997. Some clouds respond very well. Some clouds respond only to a limited degree. Maybe one or two instances when clouds didn't respond as we had hoped, probably because we got to them too late.
And when you say they responded very well, what does that mean?
It means that the storm lived longer and produced more rain over a larger area.
And how do we know that it did that? I mean, what if you hadn't seeded? I mean,
good question. We know that because we systematically analyze on a given day clouds that are seeded, and we compare their behavior with similar clouds in areas adjacent to the target area that were not seeded. And we compare the behavior of the two sets, the treated and the unseeded. And we've been doing that for about 10 years now. And we have seen a very consistent response from storms that were seeded in a timely fashion. And seeding is designed to increase the number of nuclei. These are tiny specks around which cloud water coalesces to form a raindrop. When you introduce silver iodide crystals into a thunderstorm, a young thunderstorm, that may only live 20 or 25 minutes and produce maybe a quarter of an inch, if you introduce those ice crystals early enough in the life of that cloud, more of the cloud water will be converted into tiny snowflakes, which will then attract more cloud water to form raindrops. Seeding is designed to nudge the cloud along, giving it the ammunition it needs to make more use of the cloud water that's there.
Well, what I've uncovered is that right now, for example, they have what they call geoengineering, which is upper atmospheric modification. And one of the things that's been happening is the U.S. House of Representatives has held 3 hearings, one in November 5th last year and 2 this year in February and March, to have some talking about global geoengineering governance, drawing up plans to put up particles and chemicals or do other atmospheric experiments to reduce the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. And this is ostensibly to cool us down. But the type of chemicals and particles that they're talking about putting in the atmosphere are likely to produce acid rains when they come back down, like sulfur. And they're likely to do other damage to the environment. And when you release the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth, you start to reduce photosynthesis. And without photosynthesis, all plant life will lose the energy to grow. Crop production will be reduced. Without direct sunlight, you start to have a lack of vitamin D and the associated health effects. And so I began to be concerned that reducing the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth might not be what we want to do, and that it may not cool us down. And that many of the scientists who were recommending this course of action said, well, we don't know what the consequences are, but we would like to do the testing anyway, so that we can be prepared in an emergency or such to put the chemicals up or whatever we need to do to keep us cooler, to combat global warming. And so I took exception to this because I found out through my research that one of the causes of global warming we could take care of by reducing our pollutants and some of the impacts of aviation, and we could do it very easily and without, in other words, having to resort to things that would harm the environment.
So your research tends to indicate that the persistent jet contrails are along the lines of geoengineering in terms of global warming or preventing global warming. Yes.
I don't think that they're there to prevent global warming. Persistent jet contrails are actually causing global warming because the NASA studies and the Stanford studies and some others and there's quite a number of them, all show that aviation causes global warming. It exacerbates it, and it also changes the climate. And it's responsible for 20% of the warming over Alaska and the Arctic, and they know that it's directly aviation produced. And what happens is, when jets fly and they leave these contrails that persist, besides toxic jet fuel emissions, you have this man-made cloud that is produced. One man-made cloud can last for up to 20 hours. It can cover 4,000 kilometers with either man-made clouds or white haze of some kind. And what it does when it produces these man-made clouds, the combustion process releases water vapor into the atmosphere. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So therefore, when you see these man-made clouds that change our climate, they're also exacerbating global warming.
The moral to be drawn from this dangerous nightmare situation is a simple one. Don't let it happen. It depends on you.
I find no entertainment in it anymore. Not when you've seen behind the veil. You know, it's all Brennan Circus, smoke and mirrors. It's hard to get into storylines, and because you know it's all bullshit. It's just all bullshit. Everything's bullshit, and you see the symbolism. You pick up on the underlying messages and agendas being pushed, and then it just gets upsetting, and then you get fucking pissed. So I don't expose myself to that. Hi-yo.
I don't really know. I mean, as an awake person, when you can't reach out to people, I mean, what are you supposed to do, and how are we supposed to keep our hopes up? I mean, it's so depressing when you think of it.
Yeah, it is, because the conditioning on most people, when you see them and they can't look you in the eye or they think you're crazy, it's because the condition has taken perfectly on them. And you're looking at conditioned robots, really. And they'll turn on you too. At the right time, they'll turn on you. But that's the perfect conditioning. The ones who are awake generally have always been awake, or they've known something was wrong. And they can't be conditioned quite the same way. But you're in amongst most people where the conditioning has worked perfectly, and that's the problem. I've always said the elite have a symbiosis amongst the masses of people, the general mass of people, because the masses always look towards government to solve problems, even if it's a fake problem put out by the government. We immediately run to help us, save us, you know. And there's only very few people in between, in the middle, who don't want to be stinking rich and rule everyone else's lives for them, and they don't want to belong to the general mob that just goes and watches all the porn on their internet all day long, or ball games or whatever. So it's a small group really who don't belong to either camp. That's a problem, because as I say, the masses have a symbiotic relationship with the elite, and eventually when they get all their agendas through, the elite will turn around and say, we couldn't have done it without you, to the masses.
Yeah, and that's such a... I think it's disgusting. There's no other word for it. It's just utterly disgusting. Yeah?
It is, and it's very depressing until you realize that you might be surprised how many of those in between who are not brainwashed or conditioned and who don't seek personal power can still have a voice and start changing things around. And that's the only hope that we have, is to postpone it at least long enough. They'll either wither away, or they'll come out with an even heavier hand. But that's when even the masses start to see it and they know something's wrong, when the heavy hand of the monster comes upon them. And that's what it might take. Stall them long enough until timetables, according to those at the top, cannot be stalled. If you can stall their timetables, they get awfully angry and they start using force. Force is, at least the use of force, terrifies the public, and maybe even to waking up a little bit. And that's all we can really hope for. It's because it's too perfect. It's been here too long. This system.
But we cannot use violence and force.
No, they're so perfectly good at getting us to kill each other or fight each other. This has been a strategy for centuries, and it's a perfect art of how to get it all going. We can't use that at all. And but by the same token, we have to make sure that the elites don't come out with a heavy hand and start using open force on the general public. Here's the thing too. They have been using force, or at least deadly intentions on the general public, because they know how they've been dumbing us down. They know when they rob your mind, it's the same as killing you. And when they inject things into you too that make the autism bloom, and it also makes everyone quite a few points lower in the IQ scale, makes us all sick so that we'll die off early, infertile, etc. They are physically, literally, this is a targeting, this is a murderous rampage has been going on for a long time under the usual covert actions of the United Nations that always deny what they're doing. One of the top players in this, who wrote about it, who taught Rhodes Scholars back in the 40s and 30s, internationalist again, who spoke, by the way, so he made a great speech in Sweden, was Toynbee. There were two Toynbees, father and son, and one took over from the other. But they literally taught the Rhodes Scholars for internationalism and to penetrate all governments and push them towards internationalism. He said, we always deny with our mouths what our hands are doing. And that was to become the mantra for every organization within the United Nations. We always deny with our mouths what our hands are doing. And that's still their strategy today.
Respect the elderly, mother.